Good morning, everyone. It is 9 o'clock, and welcome back to the California WaterFix petition hearing. I am Tam Dodek, board member and hearing officer. Also with me today are board chair Felicia Marcus, co-hearing officer, and also board member Dee Adamo. To my left are Dana Heinrich and Kyle Oceandesco. We also have Ms. McHugh and Mr. Baker assisting us today. Our usual quick announcements: please take a moment and identify the exits closest to you. In the event of an alarm, we will evacuate this room, take the stairs, not the elevators, down to the first floor and meet up in the park. Those of you who are not able to use the stairs should be directed into a protective vestibule. Secondly, this meeting is being recorded and webcast, so please always speak into the microphone and begin by stating your name and affiliation for the record. Third, most importantly, please take a moment right now and put all your noise-making devices mute, silent, vibrate. Please check, even if you think you did that already. Okay, a couple things before we begin. There are a couple of time-sensitive procedural matters that I want to address before we resume cross-examination by Mr. Jackson. First, we had asked petitioners' witnesses to return this Thursday and Friday to respond to additional questions from statewide board members and staff. I have conferred with my colleagues, and we've also reviewed the proposed questions submitted by the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations and the Institute for Fishery Resources. And we have decided to not ask petitioners' witnesses to return for additional questioning at this time. We may ask witnesses for petitioners or for other parties to return at some point in the future, or we may direct the parties to address certain issues in their closing briefs. But Mr. Mizell and Ms. Offenberg, your witnesses will not be needed this week. Second procedural matter concerns a written request that we received yesterday from Mr. Ryan Becerra. That might have been the day before yesterday. I don't remember exactly when, but we did receive a request from Mr. Becerra, who is representing the cities of Folsom and Roseville. Mr. Becerra requested an additional 45 minutes to cross-examine the water rights panel concerning certain water rights permits and contracts. The basis for this request is Mr. Becerra's argument that Mr. Sahlberg's testimony during so-called friendly cross-examination by attorneys for Westlands and San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority resulted in surprise testimony concerning Mr. Sahlberg's interpretation of the permits and contracts in question. This request is denied. I recognize that the cross-examination by attorneys for Westlands and Delta Mendota Water Authority was not adverse, but there are no rules that explicitly prohibit friendly cross-examination in our proceedings, as long as they do not interfere with the efficient conduct of the hearing. Mr. Becerra is correct that the board's policy is to discourage surprise testimony, but this policy generally applies to direct testimony and exhibits, not cross-examination. And finally, although I respect Mr. Sahlberg's expertise as a water right officer, his interpretation of the permits and contracts as they relate to the issue of injury to legal users of water does not have great probative value. The State Water Board is capable of interpreting water rights permits and contracts without the benefit of expert opinion. In addition, protestants may present their own testimony on rebuttal or during their cases in chief if they disagree with Mr. Sahlberg's interpretation of the permits and contracts. Or perhaps more appropriately, they can address those issues in their closing briefs. I recognize that I said I would give parties an opportunity to respond to any written request to conduct additional cross-examination of the water rights panel. We did receive 3 letters in opposition to that request, but given that I am denying the request, I do not believe it's necessary to give any additional time or opportunities for responding to that request. So we would consider that closed. A third procedural matter concerns a number of the evidentiary objections that we've received to the Part 1B cases in chief. Numerous parties have objected to other parties' written direct testimony on the grounds that the testimony exceeds the scope of Part 1 of the hearing. Based on our review, many of these objections have merit. So I want to give you a heads up that we plan to send the parties an email next week directing them to revise their written testimony if necessary, consistent with the scope of Part 1 of the hearing. This does not necessarily mean that the testimony will be excluded from the hearing altogether. Instead, some parties will need to wait and submit some or all of their testimony during Part 2 of the hearing. And we'll provide further clarification and instructions in that forthcoming email. Okay, those are my announcements for today. Mr. Becerra.
Thank you, Ms. Dodek. I appreciate the ruling. We will deal with the matter on rebuttal if necessary. I had a different question. We're coming to the close of Part 1A. It sounds like we won't have Thursday and Friday in particular. The question I have is, when do you expect to ask the petitioners to move their Part 1A evidence into the record? And at what point in time will we be dealing with the evidentiary objections to the Part 1A evidence?
Thank you. I don't have an answer for you right now, but certainly those are things we are discussing, and we will resolve them sometime this week, meaning give you an answer sometime this week.
Yes, and the reason I asked this morning unprompted is, tomorrow I guess will be the final day of Part 1A, and so those of us who've made evidentiary objections, we'd like a little bit of time to be able to deal with the issue before petitioners move their evidence into the record.
Thank you. We will discuss it during one of our breaks and let you know. Mr. Berliner, I thought you had a hand up.
I did. Thank you very much. Tom Berliner for DWR. You indicated that evidence or testimony could be revised in light of exceeding the scope of Part 1. Is that revision limited to those matters that are deemed to be part of Part 2, or are you going to permit complete revision of testimony?
No, just those deemed to be not within the scope of Part 1 and therefore should be moved to Part 2.
Thank you.
Mr. Brodsky, I saw you standing up, which reminded me to let you know that Mr. Alajam has informed me that group number 10 does not intend to conduct cross-examination, so you will be next after Mr. Jackson finishes his. Okay. Not seeing any further matters for discussion, Mr. Jackson, I will now turn it back to you for your cross-examination. And Mr. Jackson, please remind me, since it's been a number of days, what are your remaining topics?
My remaining topics have to do with the state and federal permits themselves and the concept of those permits containing a live point of diversion at Hood. At Hood. Questions for Mr. Salzberg. Mr. Salzberg, is it part of this project to transfer CVP permits to the new 3 point of diversions?
Could you please rephrase that question?
Sure. Are you applying for a change in point of diversion for the Bureau's water rights?
For the 11 water rights listed in the petition?
Excuse me?
Yes, we're asking that the WaterFix be added to the 11 permits listed in the petition.
Did the Bureau ever have a point of diversion in their permits for a diversion on the lower Sacramento River up until this date?
Objection asked and answered.
Mr. Jackson, was there a reason why you need to lay that foundation again?
One of the reasons is that I'm not sure what the answer was the last time, and I would like to clarify it.
All right, Mr. Sahlberg?
What, our permits, some of our permits on this, our Sacramento River permits list points of diversion between Keswick and the Delta. These are the diversion points for our Sacramento River settlement contractors. I guess, other than that, if you're asking, do we have a current point of diversion listed in the vicinity of Hood, other than those points of diversion I just described? No, we don't.
Thank you, sir. What was the date on the permits for the Bureau when your permits were to expire?
I don't recall at this time.
Are we, would the, what was the time limit to put water to beneficial use under the Bureau's permits?
First of all, let me clarify my previous answer. Our permits have not expired. The time to put water to beneficial use under the permits has expired, but the permits themselves are still in place. And to answer your present question, I don't recall exactly the time period. I believe there's been one extension of time that has run out as well.
So at this point, there is no ability to expand the actual water coming from the permits. Is that correct?
Objection calls for a legal conclusion.
I would interpret Mr. Jackson's question to be based on the water right permit, to which Mr. Sahlberg is an expert. So if you could answer that based on your understanding of the permit as the water rights expert being put forth by the department.
Okay. The time has expired to put water to to maximum beneficial use under the permits.
Yes, this question is for Ms. Sargent. Ms. Sargent has the time to put additional water to beneficial use on the state's permits also expired?
I believe I discussed this earlier. The time to put water to beneficial use was 2009. We filed a petition for time extension at the end of 2009. In that time extension, the department indicated that following the completion of the analysis as part of this process, that the department will be requesting a long-term time extension under those permits.
And those time extensions have been protested by a number of groups, including the ones I represent. Is that correct?
I am aware that there were protests. I can't recall who all protested those petitions.
Could you put up DWR 53, Ms. Sargent's testimony, on page 6? At the bottom. Is DWR claiming that they have a right at the present time to divert water at the location in Hood described in your testimony?
The point of diversion at Hood is still included as an authorized point of diversion in the permits held by DWR.
And is it your opinion that you can put water to beneficial use at that point, even though the time to do that expired in 2009?
As I mentioned earlier, the department has petitioned for a time extension, both for the period to complete construction as well as the time period to put water to beneficial use. We are here today to request 3 additional points of diversion, and following completion of the documents for the BDCP, we will be requesting a longer-term time extension.
Has DWR ever used the point of diversion at Hood?
As I believe I stated earlier, there is no facility currently at Hood.
Now, you indicate on page 7 of your testimony that on lines 12 through 14, that a northern delta point of diversion and through delta conveyance facility were components of the original plan for the SWP conceived in the 1950s and 1960s. Is the proposal before us today for a through delta facility?
It is. It's for diversion at the location near the existing point of diversion for delivery for conveyance to the existing Clifton Court Forebay. The location is very close to the one that is included in the permits, and the location where the water will be conveyed is the same as the existing Clifton Court Forebay.
The words through delta, what do they mean to you?
The water is being conveyed from the north of the delta through the delta to the southern delta.
All right, and these are tunnels that will go under the delta and deprive the delta of the flow, correct?
The conveyance is from the north of the delta through the delta to the southern location. It is not going through the delta channels. However, it is going through the delta.
Do you have an estimate of how much water will no longer flow through the delta channels, given the configuration?
We've been down this path with some of the other panels. I'm curious where you're going with this, Mr. Jackson?
Where I'm going with this is to provide certain facts for the consideration of the board members that highlight the fact that this is a different program, since the water itself doesn't go through the delta anymore under this proposal.
I think we're aware that the project is proposing to divert water that will no longer go through the delta. So again, I'm struggling to understand the relevance of further pursuing information that has already been established.
Thank you. I'm just trying to highlight it from the board. If the board has that fact, then I don't need the question.
That water will be diverted, and that water would not be remaining in stream. Yes, we are aware of that.
Ms. Sargent, back to the application that was filed in 2009, for an extension of time on the water rights that are at issue here. Has that hearing happened?
The board has not acted on the petition at this time.
To your knowledge, was the issue of legal injury part of the protests that were filed on that petition for extension of time?
Objection, relevance.
Mr. Jackson, that petition is not before us at this time.
The question had to do with whether or not legal injury had ever been addressed.
As part of that petition, how are you going to link it to the petition that is before us right now?
I'm going to link it by pointing out that it would be could be out of order for the board to go forward with this petition until the issue of legal injury from the extension of time is resolved.
Okay, I'll allow you a little bit of leeway since I don't believe that matter has come up before. Ms. Surgeon?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Was the issue of legal injury from the extension of time request part of the protest, to your knowledge?
I'm not aware of what was contained in any of the protests for that
Thank you.
petition for time extension.
I think that's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. All right, given Mr. Alajim's statement this morning, declining cross-examination on behalf of group number 10, we will now go back to group number 30 and Mr. Brodsky. And as Mr. Brodsky is getting ready, let me just do a preliminary check-in to see, for planning purposes, who we have today. Group 32, 33, 34, 35, 37. I see group 38. Do you have cross-examination? That's a nod from Mr. Eichenberg. Group 39, 40, 41, 42, and Ms. Womack has already conducted her cross for group 43. So unless other people show up, Mr. Eichenberg would be next, and we might have to get to Mr. Becerra's question sometime today. Begin, Mr. Brodsky.
Good morning. Michael Brodsky on behalf of Save the California Delta Alliance. Good morning, Ms. Surgeon. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to begin by asking about some of your written testimony about historical salinity conditions in the Delta. As I understand it, your testimony is that the projects have provided an incidental benefit to in-Delta users by controlling salinity in the Delta through reservoir releases, sometimes of stored water. Is that correct?
At times, yes.
Okay. And it's your testimony that construction and operation of the reservoirs has decreased Delta salinity compared to historical conditions?
At times, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. And I also understand it's your testimony as a water rights expert that in-basin users have no right to reservoir releases of stored water for their use.
My testimony is that, yes, DWR or Reclamation have the exclusive right to our storage, water that it was stored during periods when it was excess to all of the demands within the delta or within the watershed.
Mr. Brodsky, I'm sorry, before you continue, could you please run down your line of questioning for us?
I'm going to talk about the salinity testimony in Ms. Sargent's testimony, historical salinity. I'm going to talk about the settlement agreement with East Contra Costa Irrigation District and the monitoring that takes place to administer that agreement that's right next to Discovery Bay. I've asked about that gauge from 2 previous DWR witnesses, and I was heartened to hear that Ms. Sargent is actually familiar with it in her earlier testimony. The other witnesses didn't know anything about it. And then I want to talk about her conclusions about how meeting D1641 compliance requirements at D1641 compliance stations assures that in Delta users have reasonable protection of their use.
Okay, that was touched upon, and I will trust that you will explore it in a different way.
I will certainly attempt to do that, and if I touch upon something that I didn't happen to see when I was watching the video, I trust you'll bring it to my attention.
All right, please proceed.
Okay, so let's see, where did we leave off? All right, in your testimony on page 13 at lines 24 to 27, to paraphrase it, you said that in-Delta users have no right to releases of stored water to enhance water quality above what would exist without SWP CVP operations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that is because there's no right to reservoir releases because the projects already help rather than harm, or it is the case that the projects already help rather than harm the salinity issues in the Delta.
I believe I testified that that is the case because under claim of riparian or appropriative right, riparians and appropriators, in the case of riparians, they're entitled to what would be available, their correlative share of the natural flow and water quality that would be resultant from that natural flow. Appropriators are entitled to natural flow and any abandoned flows that might be available at their point of diversion and the water quality that would result due to those flows.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Solberg, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, you are. Excuse me. Yes, you are.
Okay. And do you agree with Ms. Sargent's characterizations of my answers so far?
Yes.
And so it's your testimony and understanding that the CVP has no duty to reduce salinity with releases of stored water because the CVP does not cause salinity intrusion as compared to pre-project conditions?
Objection misstates your testimony.
Yes, Mr. Brodsky, please restate your question.
Let me rephrase. It's your understanding the CVP has no duty to release stored water from reservoirs to control salinity in the Delta for the benefit of in-Delta users?
Both. Objection misstates the testimony again.
Yes, Mr. Brodsky, I'm not sure how you rephrased that question. What are you trying to get at?
I thought I was accurately restating Ms. Sargent's testimony.
That's not, I will not answer for Mr. Solberg. Mr.
Okay.
Solberg, how did you interpret Ms. Sargent's answer?
CVP and SWP under D1641 have the responsibility to meet water quality objectives in the Delta. So if we have to release water to do that, then in some cases we have to release water to comply with those objectives and requirements.
And you have no duty beyond that to release stored water to enhance water quality for in-Delta users?
Our responsibility is to meet the objectives in Decision 1641.
Okay, I think I can ask for a yes or no answer to that. The question was you have no responsibility to release stored water from reservoirs to enhance water quality for in-Delta users beyond meeting D1641.
At this point, I'm going to object to calling for a legal conclusion. If the questioner is looking for a definitive statement that he can somehow use against the witnesses by indicating there are other statutes out there that might go to the language he's using, I think that calling for a yes/no answer is not very informative to the board at this time. The witnesses have answered in what they know.
I don't plan to bring up any other statutes. And the question is, his testimony was that operation of the CVP under WaterFix will not cause legal injury to users, so he drew a legal conclusion in that regard. And my question is, in terms of within the meaning of legal injury to users in the Delta, it's his testimony that there's no obligation to release stored water from reservoirs to enhance water quality for users in the Delta, because failure to do so is not legal injury to users within the meaning of Water Code 1702, as long as he's meeting D1641.
Mr. Brodsky, that was so convoluted, I'm not sure I followed it. But Mr. Sahlberg,
Our
is it your
responsibility
is it your
D1641.
opinion, okay, that your responsibility is to meet the salinity objectives in D1641?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. Let's rest on this and move on, Mr. Brodsky.
Okay, I'd like to look at D1641, which is SWRCB 21. And if we could go to page 83. And if you could read the first full paragraph on page 83, beginning with based on. And have you had a chance to read it?
Yes.
And the final sentence of that paragraph concludes, the USBR, through its activities associated with operating the CVP in the San Joaquin River Basin, is responsible for significant deterioration of water quality in the southern Delta. Have I read that accurately?
That's what it says.
And I'd like to refer back to Ms. Sargent for a moment, if I can. Ms. Surgeon, excuse me. At page 13 of your testimony, at the bottom, lapping onto page 14, you say that quote, the SWP and CVP are not required to maintain incidental benefits to water flows or flows that may have previously resulted from a different SWP CVP operation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the different operation we're talking about is that prior to CWF, as many people have talked about, water flows through, Sacramento River water flows through the central and south delta before reaching the export pumps. And under CDF, a certain portion of that water will be diverted at the north delta diversions and won't flow through the delta. Is that correct?
Yes, water will be diverted at the North Delta and will not flow through the Delta channels.
And the fact that the water now flows through the delta results in what you've called an incidental benefit, or I think somewhere an incidental freshening for in-delta users, but not one they're entitled to.
Objection asked and answered.
I'm just asking the witness if I've accurately understood her testimony.
Please answer, Ms. Sargent.
Yes, the enhancement of water quality that was may have resulted from additional releases of project storage is not something that the in-delta users under their own water rights would be entitled to claim.
And then I'd like to turn back to Mr. Sahlberg. So isn't it true then that since we're not going to have that freshening benefit, that CWF will exacerbate the South Delta salinity problem?
Objection assumes facts, not evidence. There's been no tie to the Vernalis flow standards, not to mention the fact that the CWF doesn't propose to change operations on the San Joaquin.
Mr. Brodsky?
D1641 that we read said that it exacerbates, the CVP exacerbates the salinity problem in the quote South Delta. It
And your
does not.
question is?
My question to the witness is, isn't it true that CWF will exacerbate the South Delta salinity problem referred to in D1641 that we just read?
Please answer.
The sentence you referred to activities operating the CVP in the San Joaquin River Basin. The WaterFix will not be in the San Joaquin River Basin.
Does CVP operate Lake Shasta Reservoir?
Yes, it does.
And some of the water that's released from Lake Shasta after CWF will flow through the North Delta diversions?
Yes.
And absent the North Delta diversions, that water would flow through the Central and South Delta to reach the pumps. Is that correct?
It would flow through the Central Delta.
The pumps are located in the South Delta. Is that correct?
I'm not sure what you mean by South Delta.
Okay, let's go to could we see DWR1 at page 3?
And for the record, we're pulling up DWR 1 corrected errata.
Thank you. And could you read the title of this? Was this slide prepared by the California WaterFix proponents?
You'd have to, I do not know who prepared this slide. I know I did not.
Okay, are you aware that this is a DWR exhibit that they've introduced into evidence?
Yes.
And would you read the title of the slide?
SWP CVP facilities in the South Delta.
So this slide depicts facilities in the South Delta according to the people who prepared it.
According to the title of the slide.
And what are the facilities there down at the bottom of the slide? Could you read the names of those facilities?
Actually, we can read them. What is your question, Mr. Brodsky?
My question is, does this slide portray Banks and Jones as being in the South Delta?
In the Southwest Delta.
Okay, thank you. So my previous question was, isn't it true that your releases of water from Lake Shasta flowing through the new diversion points rather than through the delta will exacerbate the salinity problem in the South Delta?
I do not know.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'd like to turn back to Ms. Surgeon, if I may. You've testified that, in your opinion, there'll be no legal injury to users in the Delta because D1641 can be met with the operation of CWF. Is that correct?
I testified that I felt that the information provided supports a decision by the board that the petition could be approved without injuring other legal users within the Delta.
And is
Based in part on the fact that the information indicates we can continue to meet the objectives in D1641.
okay, and on what do you base your opinion that you can continue to meet the objectives in 1641?
We've been here, Mr. Brodsky.
I'll be very brief.
I would ask you to move on to your next question because she's answered that question several times.
Did you rely on the modeling in reaching your conclusion that 1641 could be met?
Objection asked and answered.
Agreed. Move on, please, Mr. Brodsky. She's walked in detail through what she relied on.
Let's go on to the next module. Thank you for pointing that out to me. I've watched most of the testimony. I'll acknowledge I haven't had the opportunity to watch all of it, so thank you. Okay, I'd like to, sort of in a different vein, testified about in your written testimony about historical salinity conditions in the Delta. Is that correct?
I included some information, some excerpts from a DWR publication, the Delta Atlas, to illustrate what I meant by the incidental benefit that is provided at times by project releases.
Okay, so let's see, on page... On page 15 of your testimony, at the top of the page, you say, historical salinity was at times greater than current conditions, particularly during drier periods. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you based that on what?
In this particular paragraph, I'm referencing the 1931 Sacramento-San Joaquin Water Supervisors Report.
Okay, anything else you relied on in your testimony with regard to historical salinity conditions?
Well, that was what I relied on in that paragraph. In the previous page, I discussed some of the information that was contained in the Delta Atlas.
Okay, thank you. Could we bring up City of Antioch Exhibit 216? And maybe if we can just view the title page. And this is a technical memorandum dated February 2010 produced by Contra Costa Water District titled Historical Freshwater and Salinity Conditions in Western Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta, and Sassoon Bay. Have I read that correctly?
That appears to be the title.
Okay, thank you. Could we go to page V, Romanet 5?
Could you please repeat the page number?
It's in the executive summary at the beginning, small v, in other words, Romanet numeral 5. Should I show you a copy of the document? I have it here.
I think we're getting there.
Okay.
That is.
Okay, there we are. Thank you. And let me read from the first paragraph. Studies and salinity measurements confirm that despite salinity management efforts, delta salinity is now at or above the highest salinity levels found in the past 2,500 to 4,000 years. Under equivalent hydrological conditions, the boundary between salt and fresh water is now 3 to 15 miles further into the delta than it would have been without the increased diversions of fresh water that have taken place in the past 150 years. End quote. And then I'd like to read to you from the bottom under key conclusions. The major conclusions of this study are, number one, salinity intrusion during the last 100 years has been among the highest levels over the past 2,500 years. The delta has been predominantly a freshwater tidal marsh for the last 2,500 years, end quote. So let me ask you, Mr. Surgeon, isn't it true that a fair portrayal of salinity in the delta should disclose that current salinity levels are historically very high?
Objection. This document lacks foundation. We don't know why it was prepared, who prepared it. Perhaps this is an advocacy piece. There's no authentication that these alleged facts are in fact accurate. So I would object to the use of this document in the conduct of any cross-examination.
I'll note your objection, Mr. Berliner, but I would like Ms. Sargent to answer.
I think it's fairly well established that prior to the projects being constructed, that development within the basin, I'm not surprised to know that there were possibly salinities 2,500 years ago that were different than what occurred 100 years ago or 150 years ago. There has been a tremendous amount of development within the Sacramento and San Joaquin watersheds. One of the stated purposes of the State Water Project was to provide salinity control, because at the level of development prior to the projects, there was considerable salinity intrusion particularly during dry years. So I don't believe the fact that the projects provide substantial salinity control would alter my opinion as to whether or not current diverters would have a right under their individual water rights to salinity that existed 2,500 years ago.
Okay. Were you aware of this report when you prepared your written testimony?
I was not.
Okay. Being aware of it now, do you think it would be reasonable in a discussion testimony that discusses historical salinity conditions to mention that regardless of the effects of the project's current conditions are very high in historical context?
I don't think the information contained in either the description or the conclusions would change the fact that the projects are currently providing substantial benefit to the maintaining salinity in the delta during the drier periods. I don't know that that would alter any of the conclusions.
Okay, so I understand it wouldn't alter your conclusions. Do you think it would be fair, though, to present at least the fact that current conditions are, when you're talking about historical salinity conditions, that the delta historically has been a freshwater marsh, and current conditions, even with the projects, if they provide a benefit, are high in historical natural context.
In the context of this hearing, we are evaluating whether or not the WaterFix facilities would have, can be constructed and operated without injuring other legal users of water. So I don't know that it's relevant to the issue before the board today.
Okay, thank you. I think we've covered that. Let's move on. Earlier in your testimony, not today, I can't remember, it was a couple of days ago, it all runs together at some point, doesn't it? You touched on a settlement agreement between DWR and the East Contra Costa Irrigation District. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And we refer to East Contra Costa Irrigation District as ECID, correct?
ECCID or East Contra Costa.
Okay. And if we could bring up very briefly Exhibit DWR 305. And is this the agreement you were referring to?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And then could we bring up DWR 327 briefly and then 328 after that briefly? And is this 327, DWR 327, an amendment to the ECCID DWR agreement?
This agreement is an agreement between East Contra Costa Water District, and the department that allowed for the diversion of some portion of the water under the ECCID contract by Contra Costa at their points of diversion. And in it, it did change some provisions of that original agreement.
Okay, thank you very much. And then could we take a quick look at DWR 328? And then so this is an amendment to DWR 327, is that correct?
This is an amendment to both DWR 327 and the original agreement.
Okay. And is it correct then that these three documents together represent the current state of the agreement with regard to East Contra Costa Irrigation District, or have there been subsequent amendments that I'm not aware of?
And none that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you. And so the general substance of these agreements is for DWR to maintain certain water quality standards at certain times at Indian Slough, or alternatively, if those aren't being met, then to provide an alternative source of water for ECCID?
The agreement is essentially to provide provide water at a certain quality at Indian Slough. That's correct.
Okay, thank you. And then if we could look at Exhibit SCDA 57, which is on the flash drive. Okay, and I'm aware that the hearing officers are sensitive to introducing exhibits on cross-examination that we might not know where it came from or that was produced for cross-examination. So this is a screenshot of the California Department of Water Resources webpage CDEC map. And I believe it's self-authenticating. It's got DWR's logo up at the top, and I don't believe anybody's going to challenge that this is authentic unless Mr. Mazzell wants to object.
We'll just identify it for now, and please go ahead with your cross-examination.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and there on the left-hand side, and I did add the red arrow and enlarger type ECD so that we would be able to see it, but it's also identified on the original map with a blue dot and the letters ECD. That's the gauge that's used to monitor compliance in the DWR ECCID agreement. Is that correct?
The agreement specifies it can be either the ECCID pumping plant, or the compliance location is actually Old River, at Indian Slough.
But there was never a monitoring station installed at Old River at Indian Slough, isn't that correct?
I'm not aware of whether it was or it was not.
Okay. Okay, but this ECD gauge is part of the monitoring agreement between DWR and ECCID.
I believe so.
Okay, thank you. And we can see on the map there that ECD gauge is in close proximity to Discovery Bay. Is that correct?
It appears so.
Thank you. And on this map, we can also see, if we scroll down just a little bit, good. Other way. Okay, I've pointed out 3 other gauges there: RSL, OBI, and MDM. And are you familiar with the RSL monitoring point being the compliance station, D1641 compliance station for Rock Slough?
That's correct.
And MDM is a DWR monitoring gauge, Middle River at Middle River. Is that correct?
I'm not familiar with all the gauging stations in the Delta. So
Not familiar with that one? Okay. Are you familiar with the OBI gauge?
again, I don't work with the gauges in the Delta.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'd like to turn back for a moment to Mr. Lehigh's testimony. At page 19 of Mr. Lehigh's testimony, he states that a station which is a good generalized representation of central delta salinity conditions is the salinity monitoring station on Old River near Bacon Island.
Excuse me, this is DWR 61, and what page are you talking about?
Page 19, okay. And that would be at lines 5 to 6. Are you familiar with Mr. Lehi?
Yes, I am.
And do you have any reason to doubt his knowledge of the fact that this would be a good monitoring station generalized for central delta salinity?
I have no reason to doubt that Mr. Lehi picked the station that was appropriate for his analysis that's discussed in that portion of his testimony.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'd like to take a look at SCDA 58 if we could. And again, Madam Hearing Officer, this is downloaded directly from California Department of Water Resources website. And in the upper right-hand corner, the output is identified with DWR's coding there. And this graph is for the period from 10/1/2012 to 10/1/2013, and it displays conductivity in microsiemens per centimeter. And so I'd like to ask Ms. Surgeon, for the period of November 2012 on this graph, it appears that salinity was below 600 microsiemens per centimeter for the entire month of November. Is that the way you read the graph?
It appears that it was.
Okay, thank you. And then could we go to SCDA 59? Thank you. And this is a similar download from DWR's website for the ECD station that we talked about earlier for the same period of time. And this graph shows that in November, same time period as we looked at on OBI, EC was between 1,600 and 2,100 microsiemens per centimeter. Is that correct?
It varied. I'm not sure if these are, I'm assuming these are daily or, I guess, 12-hour numbers.
Both are
These
12-hour mean. They're both the same metrics.
But they're not a, I guess I'm struggling with the relevance of looking at the objectives at Bacon Island with respect to the East Contra Costa Irrigation District agreement, which is...
Well, I'll make that point in my next question. This question was just simply to read the graph. Am I reading the graph correctly, or do you agree that it shows EC in November at levels between 1,600 and 2,100 microsiemens per centimeter?
It appears to show EC between about 1,100 and 2,100.
Okay, thank you very much. And so my question is that even though OBI is a good general indicator for central delta salinity, we can have a very high spike in salinity at ECD at the same time that OBI is showing much lower levels of salinity. Is that what these two graphs show?
Objection is to the relevance of a snapshot from a critical drought year as to the general trends that might be experienced over the course of what this project is proposing.
Mr. Brodsky?
Well, I haven't alleged any general trends, and I'll note that Mr. Lehi in his presentation gave a snapshot on DWR 411 from a very brief, very wet period. So I think the board can sort through who's cherry picking data and who's not.
We'll strike that commentary. Ms. Sargent, please answer.
As with any of the salinity readings throughout the Delta, if you look on a 15-minute or a 12-hour or even a daily basis, you will see variation in salinity. The objectives are not 15-minute or daily numbers. They are in regard to the ECCID agreement, I believe it's a 14-day average, and they are the objectives at the East Contra Costa location, and DWR is required to meet the objectives at that location under the contract. We have done so historically, and we propose to continue to do so. I'd also like to point out that you're using the month of November. The objectives in the agreement are for April through October.
Great.
So the period that you're talking about is outside the period under which there is a water quality objective contained in the East Contra Costa agreement.
Okay, thank you. I'm not representing ECCID. My point is that we can have a monitoring of EC at 700 or 800 microsiemens at one station, and then at the same time at another station in close proximity we can have a level as high as 2,100. Isn't that what these two graphs show? Regardless of what your interpretation of that is, isn't that what these two graphs show?
The graphs show that there can be variability due to local discharges, a number of different things, but again, you're using very short time step. And
you've answered my question.
Enough. All right. You've answered. Let's move on, Mr. Brodsky.
Okay. So isn't it true that meeting D1641 salinity standards at a D1641 compliance point does not ensure that water quality will not be seriously degraded at other points nearby at the same time?
Objection assumes facts, not in evidence.
I'm not assuming any facts, I'm just asking a question.
Mr. Brodsky, rephrase the question.
Is it possible that when you are meeting D1641 standards at a D1641 compliance station for salinity, that salinity could be much higher at a location in the delta nearby at the same time?
I don't know that it would be much higher unless there were concentrated local discharges. But again, I would like to point out that we comply with the objectives that the Water Board, under its authority for establishing the objectives that are necessary to meet the beneficial needs within the Delta, and we are complying with those objectives, and the Water Board...
Ms. Surgeon, that's not what he's asked. Let's go ahead and acknowledge the obvious. Based on the two graphics that he showed, the answer to his question is yes, it is possible.
It's possible, but without the qualifier, that
Understood.
there could be
Thank you, Mr.
substantial.
Brodsky.
Okay, let's move on then. So if we could have a DWR 4 at page 17. And that may be one of the erratas. I'm sorry, I didn't quite keep up on the errata for DWR's early exhibits. Yeah, that is an errata. Okay. So, Ms. Surgeon, this is a map of D1641 Bay Delta standard stations, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And is it your understanding that the D1641 compliant points taken together provide a reasonable picture of Delta water quality?
I'm going to object. We've had substantial testimony.
I don't believe your microphone is on, Mr. Berlin.
Sorry. We've had substantial testimony previously in this proceeding, both from operations and modeling groups with experts on water quality who were asked to answer all kinds of questions in this area, and Mr. Brodsky had ample opportunity to cross-examine them. We are well beyond Ms. Surgeon's testimony, which was making a rather simple point related to water quality and her opinion on compliance with 1641. Delving this deep down into the facts when we had experts exactly on this subject seems inappropriate with this witness.
Let's see, where are you going with this, Mr. Brodsky?
Where I'm going is that I want to ask her on what does she base her opinion that meeting D1641 means no legal injury to users in the Delta, which is within her area of expertise. And I want to lay just 2 minutes worth of foundation on what her understanding of D1641 is before I ask that.
You know what, let's go ahead and ask that question because she's answered before, but we'll get it on the record again. On
Should I
what
repeat
basis?
the question? Yeah. Is it your understanding that D1641 compliance points taken together provide a reasonable picture of Delta water quality?
I believe so.
Okay, thank you. And could we go to SCDA 1 at page 3? Well, maybe let's just go to the cover page just for a moment first to identify the document. And this is the Independent Review Panel report for the 2016 California WaterFix Aquatic Science Peer Review, which was prepared for CWF at DWR's request. And if we could go to page 15 now. And just under 2.1, if I may read, the panel believes that the PA is proposed action, they're referring to CWF there. The panel believes that the PA will create more than an incremental change to the Bay Delta system. It will affect major changes in hydrodynamics and associate... I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. I apologize, Madam Court Reporter. More than an incremental change to the Bay Delta system. It will affect major changes in hydrodynamics and associated transport throughout the system downstream of the North Delta diversion. Okay, and then I'd like to turn to SWRCB 104. And if we could go to page 3-83 when we find that one. And this is the biological opinion that was prepared by CWF and has been submitted to the federal fisheries agencies.
Yep, biological assessment.
Assessment, thank you, Mr. Berliner. And let me read from the second paragraph. Operations under the PA may result in substantial change in delta flows compared to the expected flows under existing delta configurations. Okay, so with that in mind, let me ask you, do you have any opinion on whether making major changes to delta hydrodynamics would require reassessing the location of D1641 compliance stations?
Objection. Same objection as before. We've had experts on this subject who could answer this competently.
Ms. Sargent is free to answer that she does not have an opinion.
I do not work with modeling or delta hydrodynamics, and I don't have an opinion on that question.
So of your own personal knowledge, you do not know if D1641 will continue to provide an accurate picture of water quality after CWF?
I'm going to object to this line of questioning going towards a challenge to the existing water quality control plan and not the California WaterFix.
I'm not challenging the control plan. The testimony is that D1641 will be adequate after CWF. And D1641 makes major changes to flows in the delta. So I'm asking if those changes and flows to the delta require a reassessment of D1641 locations, or if she knows.
Ms. Sargent,
That is beyond my area of expertise.
thank you. I would have been worried if you had answered.
That concludes my cross-examination. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brodsky.
May I ask a procedural question?
Mr. Brodsky?
So you had originally, with regard to the Part 1 cases in chief, issued something that you were going to call for responses to the objections.
Those were the objections to Mr. Becerra's request to recall these witnesses for additional cross-examination.
I see. I'm sorry, I
Upon which I've already ruled.
In any case, DWR has submitted objections to our evidence in our case in chief in Part 1B, and we intend to submit a reply to you on that very soon, so you can consider that.
Then please do it very soon. They are under consideration right now.
Okay.
All right. That was Mr. Brodsky for group number 30, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, no, there's no 36, 37, 38, 38. From far away there, you look like Mr. Eichenberg.
My name's Daniel Garrett Steinman, and I'm here on behalf of PCFFA and the Institute for Fisheries Resources.
And actually, before you continue, do you have a time estimate for your cross-examination?
No more than 15 minutes.
Only 15 minutes? All right, then we'll allow you to proceed, and then we'll take a break after you're done.
I just have a few questions for Ms. Sargent about her testimony that the proposed change in point of diversion is a changed water, sorry.
Please get closer to the microphone and perhaps, and please speak a little bit slower. And so that's your only line of questioning.
Yes, I'm just going to ask Ms. Sargent about her testimony that the proposed change is a changed rather than new water, right?
All right, please proceed.
Okay. Ms. Sargent, you testified essentially that if the change petition is approved, maximum annual diversions may increase compared to what would occur if the petition was denied, but you further testified that any increases would remain within the quantities authorized under the existing permits, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Would you agree with the following statement? If the change petition is approved, there may be some future point in time in which the amount of water the SWP diverts will increase as compared to the amount that would have been diverted if the change petition were rejected.
I believe we discussed the possible changes at length in my testimony as well as the modeling testimony.
So you're saying that if a change petition is approved, there may be a future point in time in which diversions will increase if the petition is approved versus rejected?
Objection asked and answered.
It's an important point, so let's answer it one more time.
Maximum annual diversions may increase. The diversion rate will not change. The allowed amount of water put to storage will not change. The total amount or the total rate of diversion from the delta will not change.
But I just want to be very clear that it seems to me that the necessary corollary of your testimony is that at some future point in time, there may be an actual increase in diversions at that time compared to what would have otherwise occurred.
Yes, we've made that point,
Okay.
and we acknowledge that point.
Just making sure. And then would you also agree with the following statement then? Approval of the change petition may increase diversions compared to what the State Water Project, as a practical matter, would have been able to divert if the petition were denied.
I don't know that I can answer that question. We are currently authorized, and we have diverted water at the maximum rate currently allowed. I can't say what the conditions in the future might be without the WaterFix, so I can't state whether or not at some point in the future we might be able to divert more than we currently have.
Without WaterFix?
Without the WaterFix.
Okay. On pages 9 and 10 of your testimony, you reference State Water Resources Control Board Order 2009-0061. Was it your testimony on Friday that you fairly characterized the reasoning in that order?
It was my testimony that I referenced some reasoning in that order that I felt was applicable to the current petition.
Okay, I just recall that Mr. Jackson asked you if you thought that you had cherry-picked any items from the order, and I believed you said you fairly characterized the reasoning, so I just wanted to be clear on that.
I believe I stated that I selected the excerpts that I felt had reasoning that was applicable to the petition.
So I'd like to bring up that document, which was on the flash drive I provided as, I believe, PCFFA 85. Ms. Sargent, are you familiar with this document?
I have read the document, yes.
Okay. So I'd just like to read a couple sentences on pages 6 and 7, which I highlighted. It's at the bottom, okay. It says, any approval of a change to allow storage or direct diversion must be appropriately conditioned to ensure that the change does not, in fact, result in increased diversions over the amount to which to which the petitioner would otherwise have been legally entitled and, as a practical matter, would otherwise have been able to divert were the permit to have remained unchanged. This includes ensuring that the current diversion limits imposed, e.g., by hydrology, the petitioner's physical facilities, and the current permit remain in effect. Ms. Surgeon, were you aware of this statement when you gave your testimony?
Yes, I was.
Okay, no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I think we'll take a bit of a longer break since we have a couple of things to discuss. So we will resume at 10:45. right, welcome back, everyone. It's 10:45. Thank you for allowing us that additional time for discussion. Before we resume, let me address Mr. Jackson.
Don't mean to interrupt, but
But you just did.
yes, there were objections filed for Part 1B. I remember a statement, I don't know whether it was in writing or just from you, that led me to believe that we should wait for a schedule to respond.
I will address that.
Thank you.
Mr. Jackson. First of all, let me address Mr. Becerra's question from this morning regarding the exhibits from petitioners for Part 1A. Using our standard practice, we will allow petitioners to submit their exhibits at the conclusion of Part 1A. We will take it under submission, and we will rule on admissibility and the objections to that in writing to follow as soon as possible. So at this time, I will, again, to be clear, allow petitioners to offer their exhibits into evidence at the close of their case in chief. As usual, we will take them under submission, and we will issue a written ruling on admissibility soon after.
Thank you, Ms. Dodek. Ryan Becerra for Cities of Folsom, Roseville, San Juan Water District, Sacramento Suburban Water District. I just want to get some clarification there. So procedurally, is this later today that the petitioners will formally move all of their exhibits in?
At the conclusion of their case in chief, any, cross-examination or redirect or recross.
And it looks like we're rapidly approaching that point in time. And I'm wondering, do the other parties, will we be arguing our objections in person, or will you just take the ones we already submitted and then you'll rule on them at some later point in time without further argument?
That's correct. We have your objections that are made in writing, and we will consider and review that in providing a written ruling on the admissibility of the petitioner's exhibits.
Okay, and one further question. This is theoretical at this point. I'm not saying this will actually happen, but
And like Ms. Sargent, I love theoretical questions.
A great deal of information has come in on cross that was not addressed by the prior written objections to the petitioner's evidence. Will there be an opportunity to capture the possible objections to information that came out on cross, or information that possibly supports the objections that were previously made? Is there some way to capture that in the
We will
record?
have that in the transcript.
Yes, but it's not actually captured in terms of evidentiary objections too much in the transcript, where protestants are objecting to the existing evidence and further evidence that was brought in. So it doesn't sound like we have a further opportunity from what you're proposing to capture any objections that may be supported by information that came out on cross. And again, I'm just trying to understand procedures, given that our previous objections were strictly based on what was submitted in writing.
And are you referring to objections pertaining to the submission of certain exhibits and testimony?
Well, let me give you
Because
an example.
obviously we've received a lot of written objections on a myriad of issues.
Let me give you a concrete example. It's usually easier to deal with that way. So the Sac Valley water users made a variety of objections to petitioner's evidence based in part on the reliance on the modeling and the lack of technical support. We have learned through cross-examination that the petitioners consider the modeling not to actually reflect what might actually happen in severely dry situations. That's new information. So we might like to support the objections we submitted previously with some reference to that testimony that came out on cross as a further basis for excluding certain technical evidence. And it sounds like the procedures we're talking about, we wouldn't have an opportunity to capture that information.
All right, thank you. We will take that request under advisement as well. Mr. Olajim?
Thank you, Chair Dodek. David Olajim, Downey Brand, Sacramento Valley Group. One further clarification. If the board is going to have the petitioners move into evidence their exhibits at the close of Part 1A, there were a number of exhibits offered by many protestants. And will protestants have an opportunity to offer their exhibits and move them into evidence as well?
Okay. And your question is whether they do that as part of 1A or as part of 1B?
That is precisely correct.
Okay. We'll consider that. Mr. Brodsky? I'm sorry, responses to? Part B. I haven't gotten to that yet, Mr. Brodsky. Right now, we're talking about petitioners moving their exhibits into the record. I will get to that point when we wrap up this issue. Are there any other questions? We certainly will take Mr. Becerra as well as Mr. Lodgum's questions under consideration and get back to you on that sometime, well, this week or next week as soon as possible. Okay, so moving on to 1B and 1B objections that have been filed. Just a point of clarification to my earlier announcements as well as to address the question from Mr. Brodsky. We are proposing to limit our ruling or request that will be sent out next week to objections pertaining to the appropriateness of certain testimony and exhibits within the scope of Part 1A. I'm sorry, within the scope of Part 1. So our focus will be on whether the exhibits and testimony submitted appropriately falls within Part 1 or Part 2. We will not be ruling immediately on the other objections associated with Part 1B cases in chief. When we get to that point, and if it's appropriate, we will request and allow for responses from the parties to whom objections were made. But at this point, we are only focused on whether we're only focused on the objections pertaining to the appropriateness of certain testimony and exhibits in Part 1. And no, we're not taking responses on that. I was under the impression that you were discussing, that's why I was trying to clarify. There were many objections on many grounds to Part 1B cases in chief. What we'll be focusing on, because with Part 1B starting at the end of October, is the appropriateness of cases in chief and testimony exhibits for Part 1.
Arguments to offer the board as to why they say belong in Part 2 should actually be in Part 1. Obviously, we'll reach whatever to their objections within the scope of whether or not something belongs in Part 1 or Part 2.
Right, I will take that under advisement.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Williams.
Yes, ma'am. Phil Williams with Westlands Water District. I support Mr. Brodsky's points about due process in terms of allowing parties to provide responses to objections.
All right, this is objections to Part 1B.
Yes, ma'am.
And right now, we're only talking about the scope.
Yes, ma'am. I
All right,
understand that.
we'll take that under advisement.
Thank you.
Okay. With that, Mr. Becerra.
Thank you. If we're done with the discussion of the evidentiary objections, I have just a question about procedures. So Part 1B is scheduled to begin October 20th. Parties have submitted their proposed groupings. I know I personally am getting a number of questions about when will I testify, how do I set my schedule? So I was just wondering what you think your timing may be in terms of setting groupings so we can start figuring out when to schedule witnesses to appear here.
We will get back to you on that as soon as possible as well.
Thank you very much.
Right. All right, let's now resume. Group number 39. Group number 40. That was Mr. Porgans, but he is not here yet. Group number 41. Ms. Seward, do you have cross-examination? Okay. Good morning, Ms. Seward.
Good morning.
What are your areas of cross-examination?
I'm going to be solely focused on impacts to water rights on a very specific location on Steamboat Slough.
Okay. And do you have one of your wonderful PowerPoints?
I did. I gave it to him already.
Okay.
So I think we have to wait. Are we going to bring up the PowerPoint? Yeah. If you could bring up SHR 104, it was one that was brought up before. There we go. And I'm actually, if we could just go ahead and go to page 4. It's a reference map, and this is from the Water Board's website, and you can see the link of where that came from. And when I accessed it, it was 8/11/2016 at 9:45 a.m. Pacific time. And I'm providing this as a reference to the different locations of drinking water wells, their generalized locations. And so my question is about, first of all, I need the names, the party names to change so I can see your names. I'm sorry. Sorry. So I'm not sure which one of you feels best answering. I'm going to just open the question. Are you familiar with the drinking water wells along Steamboat Slough? Who would like to answer that?
I am not.
You're not. Are any of you?
I'm not.
I am not.
Okay. So the representation, the testimony is that the diversion through the tunnels, or actually any diversion from the Sacramento River north of Steamboat Slough, it's my understanding you're saying it won't impact our water rights at all?
I believe I testified that that groundwater was an issue that was evaluated in the recirculated draft EIR, and it did not show a measurable impact to groundwater levels. And that I spoke with with Ms. Buchholz, who worked on some of that modeling, and she confirmed that the modeling did not demonstrate an impact on water levels associated with the California WaterFix.
Okay. Do you know what time period that was from when that assessment of impacts to groundwater was done?
That was part of the modeling done for the recirculated draft EIR. I couldn't tell you what the time period was in the modeling.
Okay. Are you, or was anybody that you spoke to aware of the current degradation of drinking water aquifer in the Delta, in the North Delta?
I'm not familiar with the drinking water wells in the Delta. I believe it was, again, I believe it was an issue addressed in the EIR, the recirculated draft, and the original draft.
And do you know what that recirculated EIR, yes, IIS, what was the conclusion of that?
I believe the conclusion was that there would not be a significant impact as a result of the WaterFix, but I would have to go back and refresh my memory based on the document.
Okay, so the next slide is, wait a minute, let me back up. So this is drinking water wells, and that is a aquifer issue. I'd like to go to slide 5. And this is also from a water board's website. You can see the location of the slide. If it got blown up, you could see where you could get it at the State Water Rights Control Board website. And this map shows different locations where either farmers or individuals, it could be residences, it could be businesses, take water out of the Delta. But it follows right along the natural waterways along there, as you can see. And so there are people who use that for drinking water. That's surface water, not the aquifer. Are you aware of any impacts to freshwater drinking water from WaterFix proposal?
I am not aware of potential impacts to drinking water from the water as a result of the WaterFix.
Okay, so WaterFix, from graphics that have been provided, it leaves approximately 5,000 cubic feet per second of flow below the intakes. Is that correct?
That's one of the bypass criteria, but there's a broad range of operations, and in many cases, the flow past the California WaterFix facilities will be much higher.
Okay, I'm concerned about dry and critical years because I'm seeing the impact of dry and critical years. I've been seeing it for 5 years. So my questions are based on dry and critical years, if that helps.
Okay. During dry and critical years, for the majority of the, the irrigation season certainly, but for the entire period when, say, term 91 is a good reference point, the projects are heavily augmenting the flow into the Delta and the resultant water quality within the Delta. For example, the critical year 2015, term 91 was in effect from essentially May through mid-December, which meant that during that period of time, the projects were releasing supplemental storage to maintain water quality in the Delta. So the water quality, the water levels, and the flow that existed during those critical periods was augmented by those storage releases.
Isn't that a requirement of operating the projects?
We are required to meet D1641 objectives, but it's not, as I've mentioned before, it's not an entitlement of any particular diverter under their individual water right in the Delta. It is a requirement, and then the project provides an incidental benefit to those users as a result of those releases. But it is a requirement of the projects due to the adoption of D1641 and not a result of an underlying water right by an individual water user.
I'm not sure I would agree with that, but I'm going to go on. If you could look at, or if we could go to slide 9, please. These are monitoring stations in the Delta, and could we enlarge it so we look more around Steamboat Slough and Sutter and Ryer Island? It might help. Can it get larger? Are any of you guys, Mr. Cook, I don't know if you're familiar with where the gauges are? No? No. So I actually wanted to focus on Steamboat Slough gauges, and on this graphic, it shows, you see the SSS, SUS, and SXS. Do you see those locations? Any of you? It's okay. Okay.
I do.
Are you familiar with these flow gauges or water quality gauges?
I'm not familiar with individual gauges within the Delta. There are compliance locations in the North Delta Water Agency agreement. Steamboat Slough is entirely within the North Delta Water Agency, and there is I believe one of the water quality locations is Steamboat Slough.
Okay, do you know which gauge that might be?
I would have to look at the agreement. We could pull up the agreement and see.
I believe it's the ones that's labeled SSS. Okay. Do you think it's possible that water quality on one single waterway, which Steamboat Slough is one of the natural waterways of the Delta, in your opinion, do you think it's possible to have adequate water quality to protect drinking water rights at the north end of Steamboat Slough at the same time as water quality in the south end of Steamboat Slough is substandard?
I'm not sure. Can you rephrase your question, please?
Do you or did the modelers express to you, is it possible to have adequate drinking water quality at the north end of Steamboat Slough at the SSS gauge and not at the south end of Steamboat Slough at the SXS gauge?
Objection is to the vagueness of the question.
Ms. Sargent,
I couldn't make any conjecture on the gradation of water quality in Steamboat Slough. What I can say is that the modeling doesn't show any significant difference due to at the North Delta Water Agency location on Steamboat Slough due to the WaterFix. And if you look at what has been provided historically, for example, again, this area is entirely within North Delta Water Agency, and it's covered under the North Delta Water Agency contract. If you look at the department's compliance at the locations in 2015, at all locations, the water quality was met or was in excess of or better than the objectives contained in that agreement, with the exception of 3 Mile Slough. And so if you look at the only location where water quality didn't continue to meet those objectives was a very small stretch between 3 Mile Slough and Rio Vista. At all other locations under that contract, the water quality objectives were met or exceeded in a critically dry year.
And that those water quality objectives were verified to be met using these gauges?
That's correct.
Okay. Could we have the other, the SHR 389, please? And again,
just clarifying that I'm opening SHR 389 errata.
Okay, this is errata. That's correct. I'm sorry. I added a couple pages, which I'm not sure I'll need to submit. I'm going to just focus on the first couple, but we'll see. So again, we're focusing in on the gauges. And you can see that on Lower Steamboat Slough, a gauge was installed only just in the last year or so, year and a half. And that's on Steamboat Slough. And you can see there's two different gauges. One has more with water quality, and one relates to flow. So can we get page 2, please? So I've repeatedly gone to this particular gauge, and this is an exact representation of what was on the website on 8/29. And then if you go to page 3, I just quick reference just so you can see page 3 is the exact same graphic. So let's go back to page 2 because it's easier to see what's going on. So what I noticed is the gauges, there's gaps in the data. There's been a pattern of gaps in the data for Steamboat Slough. And if you could move the slide down a little bit so you can see the bottom part of the slide. And in fact, for 2015, which is a critical year, which I can tell you for a fact and I can show.
What is your question, Ms. Seward?
My question is, how can DWR or USBR be sure of effects to flow and water quality when the gauges don't consistently report?
Again, I don't work with the gauges in the Delta. I don't believe this is one of the gauges that it's used for compliance. It's measuring flow, not water quality. And I don't know that there are issues with the gauges at the compliance locations. And a gauge is a piece of mechanical equipment, and if there is an outage, it's addressed as quickly as possible. But I can't represent whether or not an outage at this location in a new station is representative of any other point in the Delta.
The water quality, you said, is based on the gauges. Is that correct?
There are water quality monitoring stations where the water quality is recorded for the North Delta Water Agency agreement, yes.
Okay, I did not, okay. If there were, wait a second. Sorry, I'm trying to find one other document. Are you aware of how many times a farmer or somebody using water from Steamboat Slough for irrigation, how many times they can use water that is over 2 ppt before it ruins the crop or the landscape?
Asked and answered. The witness has already explained that she's not an agronomist.
Ms. Surgeon, I assume you respond as you don't know.
That's beyond my area of expertise.
Okay. Would you be able to express in numbers how much cubic feet of diversion is needed, is diverted to result in 5 million acre feet of delivery?
Excuse me, I'm not sure I understand your question.
Okay. Where so many of the documents refer to, the tunnels and everything, refer to diversion of 9,000 cubic feet per second. And
That's the design capacity of the proposed facilities combined, three different intakes. But they're not proposed to be operated at 9,000 CFS all the time. Operation will depend on the inflow at the time, the bypass criteria, which is not simply 5,000 CFS. It depends on, there's criteria for a first flush. So it varies depending on the time of year and the various operations. So it's not 9,000 CFS every day to arrive at a number of total export. In addition, the South Delta facilities will continue to be used.
Okay. Constantly? South Delta is going to continue to be used year-round as well?
Asked and answered.
So yes, we have gone through this, Ms. Seward. Curious, where are you going?
I thought I heard it answered different than what I had heard before, but I'll just let it go. I can look in the record on that. Okay, so the data I've been provided by DWR refers, I'm looking again at critical years, dry years, this 5,000 cubic feet of flow below the proposed intakes. Do you believe, in your opinion, is that sufficient flow to keep Steamboat Slough, Sutter Slough, Minor Slough, Sacramento River, Georgiana, and the Delta cross-channel gates, assuming they're open? So that's 6 waterways to split 5,000 cubic feet of flow, plus all the farmer use, Delta use. Do you believe that it makes common sense that that's going to leave sufficient flow to keep fresh water in the Delta?
Objection hasn't answered in relevance as to the question.
Mr. Surgeon, was this one of the diversion points you analyzed? Do you have any specific knowledge in order to answer that question?
I don't. I'm not an expert on Delta hydrodynamics. I would, again, just like to clarify that if we are concerned about the dry and the critical years and the periods during most frequently the summer months, the very low flow periods, the water that is entering the Delta is, the natural flow is heavily augmented by the State Water Project upstream storage releases. So under those conditions, the water quality, the flow are greatly enhanced by the upstream storage releases to a condition. So it represents a condition that would not exist absent those upstream storage releases.
Okay, so I'm going to shift to, I think it might be helpful to go back to the first page of this slide set. I'm just using it as a map reference. Are you familiar with where Prospect Island is and Liberty Island and those areas?
Generally.
Okay. When the modeling was done, you know what, I'm going to withdraw that. I think I do have, I've asked when I needed to, but I do have a procedural question.
Yes, Ms. Stewart.
Okay. First of all, I want to apologize. I uploaded many documents that really relate to Part 2, and so I do plan to submit clarification, and I just assume the procedure has been a little bit confusing, so I wanted to get everything up there that I could possibly use.
So you've anticipated our request. We will be sending out an email to parties that submitted Part 1B testimony and exhibits that are outside the scope of Part 1. So you are well ahead of the curve.
Okay, thank you. So procedurally, should I just remove those? Okay, I can do that. The second question is, there was a blanket objection to all of my documents, and I was actually out of town last week. I only received like a general email. I guess everybody did that. What is our timing for responding to that?
Okay. Thank you. I was going to bring this up later, but since you brought it up now, let's go ahead and address that. That question was asked earlier by Mr. Brodsky as well as Mr. Williams. Parties can submit responses to 1B objections at any time. However, if you're going to respond to objections that pertain to the scope of Part 1, please submit those responses this week.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so got that this week by Friday at 5.
Mr. Wood, hold on. Okay, my understanding is that you cannot remove the documents that you have already uploaded, and this will go to everyone else too who receives the email from us next week. You may upload documents with strikeouts and removals of materials that should be in Part 2. Did I just further complicate things?
No, I'm not. I just want to be able to understand. So if I have a document labeled, 401, actually, I had actually submitted that last time around.
Okay, you know what? I'm going to hand this over to
Okay.
Mr. Ocean Disco or Ms. Riddle. By the way, let the record show that Ms. Riddle joined us earlier today.
I apologize. So this is a technical matter for all the parties. Once their FTP site has gone live, at that point you can't remove any of the documents. And so what we're asking for is that if you have documents that are more germane to Part 2, that you let us know only by adding the documentation through the strikeout format.
I think this is probably going to require some kind of a letter with you explaining what you're potentially removing. If it's testimony and your testimony still stands, you need to strike out the portions of the testimony that pertain to Part 2. If there's any ambiguity, you should be explaining that to us, which are in part, you're proposing to be part of Part 1 and which you're proposing to be part of Part 2. So in some way you need to document that for us, either through strikeout, underline, or through a letter indicating that you're not proposing to enter in exhibits that you previously submitted, because you can no longer modify those exhibits on our FTP site, and many of those have already been posted on our website, so we're going to have to go back and do some cleanup work on that.
I have a suggestion, which is perhaps the clearest way if you want to remove exhibits from your 1B case in chief and hold them for Part 2, is to submit a revised exhibit index that indicates what exhibits you're actually planning on offering in Part 1B.
Thank you. That sounds like a little bit easier way of doing that.
Ms. Stewart,
Yeah.
we will attempt to be as clear as possible in the email that will go out next week regarding instructions on how to revise and submit the appropriate exhibits for Part 1B.
Okay, thank you. So then one more procedural. The last time I spoke here, I had been asked to and did submit the graphics provided by DWR, and was that accepted into evidence as it is, or is there something else that's needed?
So you touch on the second issue that I was going to address earlier that was raised by, I believe it was Mr. Alajam, regarding exhibits that have been offered in cross-examination by parties for Part 1A. We would like those exhibits to be offered into evidence after your case in chief in Part 1B. So hold on to that. and move that into the record after you finish your case in chief in Part 1B.
Okay. Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you. Ms. Reserve is coming up.
Good morning. OSHA Reserve for Land and Other Parties. Since we're talking procedural stuff, I wanted to just bring up one more somewhat related issue. We did receive objections on September 9th, many of us, to testimony, exhibits, etc. There was a pretty large group of objections coming from DWR that came nearly 5 hours after the board's deadline. And, you know, one of my group, Land, happens to be within that. We've worked very hard to comply with the deadlines. I understand when emails are sent, sometimes it can take longer if there's a lot of attachments. And so I think when there's just a few minutes, you know, I understand it's all within the board's discretion, but I know that there were 6 parties that received objections that, you know, were several hours late. And there's no the DWR has represented that it intended to send those earlier on in the day, but I don't think there's any evidence to show that. So you know, we don't know when those were written. All we know is when we received them. And so I understand it probably is to your attention, but I want to note that, you know, we of course will respond to what we need to, and we can, but that's another moving part in this analysis.
Thank you. It's noted, my understanding was that they had listed those specific objections in their attachment B that was sent on time, but failed to actually include the attachment themselves.
It was in an exhibit list, but yeah, it wasn't like a proof of service that said, oh, we've prepared objections to all these things. It was simply a table at the back of the objection. So it wasn't typically like for me in litigation with a proof of service, it's going to list every single item that I'm giving a proof of service for. Instead, it was an exhibit to the back. So you might want to look at the way it's set up. I don't believe that's a proof of service of those particular documents.
I actually did look at it, but Mr. Berliner or Mr. Mizell, would you like to state a response for the record?
Yes, please. If it is helpful to the board, the metadata date stamp on the files that were submitted is before the deadline came and passed. So while I appreciate Ms. Meserve's observations and concerns, I believe that the data contained within the metadata of the files actually is evidence that the objections were prepared before the deadline, and our representation that they were simply left off the email is a correct representation.
Thank you. So noted.
Good morning. Tim Wyszewski for the San Joaquin Tributaries Authority. If a party is not submitting a case in chief for 1B, when can we move to put our cross-examination exhibits in?
Either now or at the end of Part 1B.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. And I see that Mr. Porgans has joined us. He actually did inform us earlier that he would be conducting cross-examination. So I will turn it over to Mr. Porgans now.
Good morning, Co-Chairman Dudak and Marcus. Thank you for affording me the time to bring some of these issues to your attention. And as always, I'm not totally familiar with protocol, so if I'm out of order, you just straighten me right out.
Well, thank you for joining us, Mr. Porgans. Before you begin, could you please sort of give us an outline of the topic areas you'll be conducting cross-examination on?
Yes, I think I can manage that much. Basically, what I'm doing here today is I'm going to review some of the previous water right decisions that the State Board had adopted for the operation of the Central Valley Project in particular. And I'm looking at that information to try to provide myself with some level of confidence that when the Bureau or the project operators say they're going to be compliant, we need to go back and revisit to say if they said that once before, twice before, or 3 times before. And the reason why I think that's important is because if someone tells you something and they give you your word, and if they don't come through, well, you have to evaluate the situation for what it is.
Okay.
And I'm not casting aspersions on the Bureau or anybody else. I'm not doing that. But I am going to, if I may, first of all, I am Patrick Porgans, and I'm representing Planetary Solutionaries. And today I'll be focusing in on Water Rights Decision D990, D1422, D1485, and D1641. Okay? And what I did, and I do have 1 or 2 potential exhibits that I would like to distribute to the Bureau, and I do have copies for the board, for the members here, and we do have it electronically so we can show you up there what Exhibit 121 and 122 is about. So on that, may I give this to the Bureau? So there's 3 pages to that exhibit, and if we can, I don't know if we have Porgan's Exhibit 121 and 122 where we can put it up electronically. I don't know if they have that over there yet. But in order to proceed with this, oh, here they are. Okay, so that's 121, and then we have 122. That's 121. There's 122, thank you. It's a total of 3 pages, and we'll be making reference to those as we move forward on this line of questioning. And so before I begin, I'd like to come back to that, but I would like to have DOI's Exhibit number 4, Ray Schallberg's testimony. And I'd like to go to page 2 on that. Oh, okay, right there. For the project, this section of Part 1 of the CWF hearing, this is Mr. Schallberg speaking. I will describe the water rights permits held by Reclamation for the CVP and the contracts of delivering water. Decisions on the timing and quantities of water can be delivered are based on projected and real-time hydrological and hydrodynamic information, more fully explained in the testimony of Mr. Milligan. So in managing the delivery of the CVP, Reclamation operates its facilities to meet all statutory requirements prior to satisfying contractual obligations, including Water Right Decision D1641. And that's SWRCB 21. We might have to come back to that later. And then it goes on from there. It's going to meet everything. So then Reclamation, it goes on to say, Reclamation joins in the testimony of Ms. Maureen Surgeon of the Department of Water Resources on the changes requested in the CWF petition for change. The fact that this petition does not initiate a new water right and the requested changes will not injure other legal uses of water. how do I move this guy down? We have oh, thank you. Reclamation, so anyway, my testimony, so they're joining in and supporting Department of Water Resources request for the change of petition for change. And it doesn't include new water rights, a new water right. So he says, my testimony concludes with the description of the various CB contracts and the CWF petition for change and does not affect the terms and conditions of the contract. Well, I went back and looked at the issue there, and I came to the realization that it's apparent, if you look at the information, that the Department of the Interior, or more specifically, the Bureau of Reclamation, makes reference to the fact that it's going to be compliant. It's going to comply with all the rules and regulations, and it's going to do that in a manner that it will...
So, Mr. Borgens, I need for you to ask the witness a question.
Okay, excuse me.
If you could slow down a little bit too, please.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. Can you put that back up to the previous page, please? Or yeah. So in its testimony, it says it's going to comply with it. So my question is, to your knowledge, this can be for any one of the three of you, it doesn't matter. To any one of your knowledge, do you know if the Bureau has made similar commitments to meet all the standards and requirements that are issued under the terms and conditions of their permits issued by this board?
I'll just object as vague. I'm...
The question, as I understand it, Mr. Borgens, to Mr. Solberg is, has the Bureau or department made any commitments to comply with the requirements of this board? And the answer had better be yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so I did. Okay. So what I'm saying here is if we go over to, let me see if it's Exhibit 121. Can you put Exhibit 121 back up there, please? Let me see if I can see this here. So on this one here, this is Paul Fucciani. Do you recognize who Paul Fucciani is over there at the Bureau of Reclamation?
Yes, I know who Paul Fujitani is.
Thank you. So this is a memo that's coming from Jerry Johns, and it's going to Paul Pettit. Now, the reason why this is important, it says right here, Paul Fucciani of the Bureau of Reclamation called today to inform us the Bureau will not be meeting the 500 TDS requirement at Pinellas for June. Are you aware of this?
This letter is from 1990. It predates my employment with the Bureau, so I'm not familiar with it.
Is anybody here that goes back before 1990 on this subject matter?
I have worked for the Department of Water Resources since 1991.
So yeah, see, the collective memory is gone. Anyway, so it says here, it says on paragraph 2, Mr. Fucciani also stated the Bureau intends to try to meet the 500 TDS on a daily basis, but not on the monthly average, as set forth in Decision 1422. They will not concern themselves with meeting the monthly standard.
So your question, Mr. Borgens,
My question is that I asked them, I don't think they can answer it. Is anyone familiar with that this is something that has already happened?
If I may, I was not working for the department in 89 or 90, but I would just like to point out that these were both critically dry years in a sequence of dry years, and I believe the 1989 document references low flow in New Melones, which is not an uncommon problem in critically dry years. It appears that they were attempting to balance the available storage at New Melones and the ability to maintain a water quality objective at Vernalis.
And to your knowledge, would that have been consistent with G22 meeting the Vernalis standard?
I'm not familiar with the...
Can we go to the next exhibit up there, please? 122. So I don't know how to approach this, Chairperson, but if you can help me out here, because if they don't know what I'm asking them, and these are records, these are documents in the record.
I understand, Mr. Porgan. So let me attempt to provide what I think is the direction that you're going to. Obviously, there have been occasions in the past, near as well as distant, where there have been difficulties in achieving some of the standards. Were you aware, either any of you, can you provide any explanation to Mr. Porgans of why, in your opinion, that should not reflect negatively on the projects in terms of its commitment going forward?
The department operates the projects to strive to meet the requirements in D1641, as well as all their other requirements. In every year, there are certain year types that provide particular challenges, and critically dry years are one of those particular challenges. The project Mr. Lehi, I believe, discussed at length what he tries to do in real time to address meeting those objectives. I believe the operations during the most recent drought are representative of what the projects try to do when conditions were historically dry. There was very close coordination between the Water Board and the fisheries agencies, the department and reclamation as to what the hydrology looked like. It was updated as more information became available. The inflows to the reservoirs were extremely limited, particularly in 2015 when snowpack was only 5% of average. And there was a lot of modeling done, a lot of discussion with the various agencies to try to determine what would be the best use of the storage that was available and what other measures could be taken in the Delta. There were temporary barriers constructed. So we try to make every effort to meet those objectives to the extent we can. And I think if you look at the success in 2015 in meeting those objectives compared to what conditions looked like before the projects were operating, you can see the efforts and the success that the department has in complying with those objectives.
I appreciate the effort on the Bureau's behalf. I try to meet in the Interior Department's behalf to try to meet those standards. Thank you. However, isn't it true that any time you're going to deviate from a standard, you have to come and ask the board about it? Isn't that the way it works?
The department in both 2014 and 2015 did file a temporary agency change with the board to try to address the critically dry conditions, yes.
So, but you went through the process on that to make that so it's in compliance with the conditions and terms and conditions of your permit.
That's correct, and it was a joint petition.
Okay, so in this exhibit here, this 122, what do we call it now? It says right here in the first paragraph, and I'm going to ask you the question. It says the Bureau believes water should not be released to meet water quality at Vernalis the rest of this year. They didn't come. Did you have knowledge, or does anybody know that? Did anybody know if they came to the board to ask them to do that?
That predates my time
Okay, can we move down that page, please? Because I got to get to this bottom line issue here. The next page, please.
Mr. Porgans, given that these witnesses, this predates their employment at their respective agencies, and they do not have a lot of deal of familiarity with this particular one, is there a more general question that you would like to ask them rather than specifically focus on this particular incident?
Well, if you think that would be helpful, I'll do that, but I would like to proceed just to the next page on the last paragraph, and then I'll go there. Now, in this, this is State Board speaking to Pettit. In this paragraph on page 2 of 122, I told Mr. Jonas that the staff's willingness to allow an increase above 500 pptd standards without recommending enforcement actions last year was based on the critical water supply conditions the previous 2 years and the uncertainty of the 1989 water supply. But it goes on to say, I better read it verbatim. It was also influenced by the fact water from storage and new Maloney's would be needed to maintain water quality. However, this year on the heels of a below normal water year, and currently New Maloney's is gaining water to storage. I emphasize that the State Board did not recognize the 70,000 acre-feet limit. Okay, so let's go out of there now, okay? I would like to have these considered for evidence, according to 121 and 122.
And your question to these
them?
witnesses?
Yeah, okay, and are you familiar with D1641?
Yes, I am.
Is that within your time? Okay, in D1641, and I got to find my place here. It made reference to the fact that the amount of water that and the terms and conditions would be satisfactory for meeting the Vernalis standards. Are you familiar with that at all, or do I have to dig it out?
The Vernalis standard is a Bureau objective.
Yes.
I mean, do you have a specific question related to the Vernalis standard?
Yeah, I was asking you about the new the Vernalis standard, and I'm questioning you as to whether, in fact, have you ever gone back and conducted a review of your compliance there at Vernalis?
Is your question directed to me?
To either one, whoever can answer it. And if you
I just
can't
wanted to
answer
make it clear that it's not a department objective.
It's not a department objective. I understand that. But
Mr. Solberg, are you able to answer that question?
I believe Mr. Lehigh's testimony contained information on compliance with D1641 standards. I do not recall if Vernalis was specifically mentioned in that testimony.
Well, I'm going to have to let that go because I can't find my place here. I mean, I'm obviously missing something. Could be a couple of brain cells. Anyway, so getting back to, I want to go back to D990, if I may. And I do believe that is an exhibit that the State Board has up there. It may be SWRCB 13 and 14. Can you pull 13 up? State Water Board Exhibit 13.
Ms. Surgeon, if you need to stand, the podium is available behind you as well.
Thank you. I think I'm doing okay up to now.
And the board chair is offering drugs.
They can be our friends.
Mr. Borgans,
Yes.
can you please identify the exhibit you wish us to bring up one more time, please?
I believe it was the one you have there, 13. I'm going to go to 14 too. But I want 13 first, if you would, please.
Right now on the screen is SWRCB 13, which appears to be a permit. Can you verify, is this what you wanted us to bring up?
Yes, I believe that's it. I just have to peruse it for a minute and determine where I am with this. Now, under the terms and conditions of, oh, wait a minute, hold there. Just give me a minute, I gotta do some work here. Is this particular exhibit pertinent to the amount of water that the Bureau can export from either the Sacramento River or the San Joaquin Delta, Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta?
I would just like to clarify, the document that's up now is a petition for temporary transfer. It's commonly referred to as the consolidated place of use. It relates only to exchanges between DWR and reclamation contractors of previously allocated state water project or CVP water. And those contractors are all located downstream of the Delta. It has no impact on the amounts of water that are exported from the Delta.
Okay, can we see 14, please? Thank you for explaining that to me, clarifying it. Oh, this is another transfer?
Yes.
I'm actually looking for water right permit 12722, which was filed in application 9363. And it says here, I thought it had SWRCB 13, but it's apparently not the one.
Perhaps, Mr. Porgans, if you might ask the question that you want to ask of these witnesses
Okay.
regarding that while Mr. Baker or Mr. Long is looking for it.
Okay, my question is, are you familiar with water rights permit?
Mr. Porgans, the permit you're looking for is up. The original permit is at the back of this 145-page PDF.
Yes.
And then on top of it are amending orders over the years in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And then at the very, very top is the latest amending order approving the latest TUCP.
Thank you, Mr. Long. I'm going to ask Mr. Porgans to state his specific questions to these witnesses. If we need to pull the document up, we will, but let's see first. Mr. Porgan, what is your question?
My question is, are you familiar with the water right permits 12722?
Yes.
And do you know what exhibit that would be? Is it a DOI exhibit or would it be a state board exhibit?
Let me ask you, Mr. Porgans, to get to the substance of your question. I rather we not spend time doing a document search. I'm more interested in the substance of your question.
Okay, so under that permit 12722, do you have an idea of how much water the Bureau is allowed to export under the terms and conditions of its permits? That would be on table 1, T990, page 11.
I'm sorry, he's asked me about a permit, but then he's referring to a water rights decision.
What is your understanding of the Bureau's allowed diversion under your permits?
Okay, permit 12722 allows us to divert 1,000 CFS and store 310,000 acre feet. The season of diversion for direct diversion is from the 1st of September through the 30th of June, with year-round diversion rights in the Delta and below Shasta. The total storage under this permit and permits 12721 and 12723 is not to exceed 4.493 million acre feet.
And all that is in the record, Mr. Porgan, so your question again is?
To your knowledge, have we exceeded the requirements, or have we been compliant with the requirements that are listed in 12722 and 12723?
To my knowledge, we have complied with the terms and conditions of this water right permit.
And what is the capacity of the Delta Cross Channel in terms of the amount of water it can move through there?
I don't know that.
Okay. Does anyone here know that? Thank you. Now, I want to go to I have a question about the Bureau of Reclamation continues to request, or DOI continue to request postponements for the total amount of water that it ultimately will use under the terms and conditions of its existing permits. Are you familiar with that? Any one of you?
When you refer to a postponement, I assume you're referring to a petition for extension of time?
Correct.
Yes, I'm familiar that we currently have one pending in front of the board.
And can you explain to us what one that is?
It is, we have asked the board for an extension of time to put water to maximum beneficial use.
And that's pertaining to your water rights for the Bureau and
For the water rights listed in the petition, yes.
Okay. I'm having a problem with these lights, so you have to give me a minute here. So what is the status of the of that particular request by the Bureau?
It is still pending before the board.
And how long has it been pending?
I don't know exactly.
Does anyone know? Okay. No one knows. Okay. You know, I would like to know how much water rights does the Bureau profess to hold here in the state of California?
Objection is to relevance.
Mr. Pongance?
The relevance is if they have much more than they have in use now, we're asking questions about where that water ultimately is going to be used for and when that decision is going to be made. It's been 20 years.
We're focused on the petition pertaining to the WaterFix that is before us. So I'm going to direct you to keep your focus on that unless you can tie the relevant of your line of questioning to it.
Okay. I'll just have to skip that one too. So, are you aware that there were provisions contained in that order, 990, that the board left the opportunity to exercise specific discretion over the permits, which is a standard procedure? Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Well, under number 27 on 990 on page 86 and 87, it states, upon the request of the board, permittee shall make measurements and maintain and furnish to the board such records information as may be necessary to determine compliance with the terms and conditions of this order, including the recognition of the vested rights for the future purpose of determining the quantities of water placed to beneficial use. Oh, I'm very sorry. Forgive me. Recognition of the vested rights and for the further purpose of determining the quantities of water placed to beneficial use under the permits, both by direct diversion and storage. The question is, to your knowledge, has reclamation been required to provide the compliance, any compliance information referenced in the terms and conditions of 27?
The Bureau files yearly permittee reports for all its water rights with the state board.
That's not my question. I'm asking you specifically, did you file on 27? Did you ever have to file any information on what's stated in 27 of the D990?
I believe filing the permittee reports complies with the term, term 27.
Okay, I'll let that one go. You know, I really don't know how to put this one here to you, but has any one of you gone back and looked at historical violations of the Vanilla standard in your work?
First of all, I don't agree with the characterization of violations.
Mr. Selberg, I'm well aware that this was discussed as part of the operations testimony Was there any evaluation that you personally conducted that you could testify to?
No, I have not done that.
Has any one of you done that? Thank you.
Not aware of it.
Okay. Okay. Now I have a question, Chairperson, but you have to help me out because they don't know how many violations occurred. And I can understand that they weren't there. But my point is, I'm going to be submitting another exhibit, 123, that's going to say, not 100, not 200, not 300, not 400, more than 400 violations of the Vernal standards before 1990. So I can tell you now, this is my point. So you're sticking with the fact that you're going to be compliant, no matter what. Is that correct? That's what it says here.
Yes.
Thank you. That pretty much concludes my testimony. And Chairperson and co-chairpersons, forgive me. I've never been this bad in my life. Thank you so much. Have a good day. And I want that submitted into the record if you would consider it. Thank you. And then on the procedural matter, I'm still pending an answer to some questions about my situation.
Thank you. Yes,
Thank you so much.
we are aware of your request.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Porgans. Group number 42. Not here. And Ms. Womack had conducted her cross-examination earlier. So that concludes the list of cross-examiners. Mr. Mizell, Ms. Offenberg, do you have redirect?
Not at this time, thank you.
Me neither. All right. So at this time, do you wish to offer your exhibits into evidence?
Certainly, I can offer our exhibits into evidence verbally if you wish. We will be offering in all the exhibits listed on our revised notice of intent to appear in exhibit list that was submitted on, let me see here, I believe it was in June. On June 21st. With the replacements that were submitted later for DWR1 errata corrected, DWR2 errata, DWR4 errata, DWR5 errata. We will also be submitting into evidence the modeling input-output files submitted to the State Water Board on May 25th, 2016 that consist of modeling runs for H3, H4, Boundary 1, Boundary 2, the no action alternative for CalSim, and the no action alternative for DSM2. Attached to the revised exhibit list were State Water Resources Control Board's exhibits 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 21, 23, 27, 30, 65, 83, 84, and 87.
Ms. Offenberg?
Yeah, so we would offer into evidence all of DOI's exhibits. Do you want me to go through each number? They're consecutive DOI 1 through DOI 31 with a DOI 5 errata or DOI 5A. At this time, we would offer all of those into evidence, and including. Did you want the State Water Resource Control Board exhibits as well?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
I'm going to need 2 seconds to pull those out. Looks like we have State Water Resource Control Board 1 and 2, 21, 87, 84, State Water Resource Control Board 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. and that looks like it's it. All right.
Mr. Mizell and Ms. Offenberg, are the board exhibits that you just listed the same ones that are listed on your index? Because I missed some of them, but if you've got
For
them
my
listed on
purposes, they are.
Okay.
I don't remember, since I don't have a computer, whether we put those on our index or not. So if we could look at it, I could tell you. But anyway, they're referenced in Mr. Sahlberg's testimony.
Ms. Offenberg, would you please take a look at the monitor in front of you as we're displaying what's on the web right now?
Okay.
As we've reflected the exhibit index for DOI, can you please review the State Water Resources Control Board exhibits that you identified and let us know if how we have them reflected on the website is correct as to how you want to enter them into the record?
Okay, hold on a second. Since we are only taking them under submission at this point and are not yet ruling on admissibility, I'm going to request that Mr. Mizell and Ms. Offenberg submit in writing to us the list of all the exhibits that you are moving into evidence, and please do that by noon tomorrow. And I'm going to, in response to Mr. Becerra's question earlier, allow any supplemental objections, and that would be objections to petitioner's exhibits that are based on new information solicited during cross-examination. We will allow you until noon Friday of next week to submit those supplemental objections. And we will review everything, and we will issue a written ruling on the admissibility of the exhibits being moved into the record by petitioners. Mr. Becerra.
Yes, thank you very much, Ryan Becerra, for a number of protestants. I very much appreciate the clarification on the procedures. We will submit whatever supplemental objections we have by next Friday. I do have one question, and perhaps it'll be cleared up by what petitioners submit tomorrow. Mr. Mizell offered into evidence modeling files that the petitioners have made available on the website. There's been some confusion about this as to the exact status of those. Those were never marked as exhibits, and I don't believe that there was any testimony presented by Mr. Munivar to authenticate them. So I need to understand, are those now being presented as exhibits with all of the massive amount of information that is contained in those modeling files, even though they were not previously marked as exhibits prior to the May 31st exhibit submission deadline? Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Mizell, please address that in your submission by noon tomorrow. All right. At this point, I think I'm going to request that parties submit into evidence the documents they use for cross-examination at the end of Part 1B, just for clarity. Let's everyone wait until the end of 1B to move all your exhibits as part of your case in chief. If you are presenting a case in chief, or even if you're not, you may move your exhibits from cross-examination into the record at that time. And then one final reminder, just to reiterate something I said earlier, with respect to objections for 1B, parties who would like to file responses to objections pertaining to the scope, just to the scope of Part 1B exhibits and testimony, please do that by noon this Friday. As far as responses to objections regarding other matters pertaining to 1B, you may do that at any time before we conclude with Part 1B. But any responses to objections pertaining to the scope of what may be presented in Part 1, those responses should be provided to us by noon this Friday. Mr. Becerra.
Thank you very much. Just one request for clarification. If everything you just said could be put in an email, That, I think, would save everyone a lot of time and possible confusion about how we'll be proceeding. So that's just a polite
Do you
request.
promise me that you will not then provide a response to the email?
I personally promise you that I will not respond to that email.
And just to be clear, I think we will probably want to establish a deadline for responses for 1B, but we'll establish it at a later date. I don't think any time in 1B, in the case that we want to act on those before the end of 1B. So
True.
we'll let you know, but it will be in the future.
Thank you very much.
All right. Have I forgotten anything? Mr. Mizell?
Yes, I'd like to make one clarifying point to my response to Ms. Meserve's concerns that were raised earlier. It's been brought to my attention that the PDFs that were actually attached to the email reflected a revised date stamp. However, we do have the originals that were date stamped as 11:22 a.m. I can provide those to the State Water Board along with an affidavit that they are the originals. The manner in which she saved them on her desktop prior to attaching them to the email resulted in a change in the date stamp.
Please do so. All right. With that, we are concluding Part 1A of the WaterFix petition hearing. I thank you all for your very efficient participation in this process. And there will be forthcoming emails and rulings from the hearing team. And I look forward to seeing all of you in October. Thank you.